Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Jed Herman, Senior Advisor for Policy Outreach in the Office of Recovery Programs at the U.S. Treasury Department. Thank you for joining us today for our second session in a two-part series on ways jurisdictions can use the state and local fiscal recovery funds, or SLFRF, to create more equitable recoveries for their community. Yesterday, we hosted a session on how recipients can incorporate equity into their SLFRF spending and the important role of community engagement in ensuring these funds meet the needs of communities. We heard from San Antonio, Texas, and King County, Washington about their efforts in these areas, as well as the Southern Economic Advancement Project, which shared some leading equity and engagement practices from across the country. A recording of yesterday's session will be posted on our website in the coming days. We will also post a recording of today's session on the website as well. Today's session will focus on the evaluation of performance metrics, which are also important tools for ensuring an equitable economic recovery, maximizing the impact of the state and local fiscal recovery funds in your community. Specifically, for today's agenda, we'll begin with an overview of the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund and how it is designed to facilitate equitable outcomes. We'll then provide a background on the Equity and Outcomes Resource Guide that we have just released, and that is the subject of today's webinar. We'll have a peer discussion with Lauren Larson from Colorado and Shemai Kearney from the City of Baltimore. Following that, Beth Flower of the Centers for Civic Impact and Jen Tolentino from Results for America will share some insights and provide a national perspective and best practices. Then we'll share some more information about the Equity and Outcomes Resource Guide before moving into a Q&A session with all of today's presenters. On that note, as you have questions throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A function so we can address them during the Q&A at the end. A few housekeeping notes before we dive in. First, as I mentioned, a few days from now, we'll post a recording of today's webinar and the accompanying slides on our website, where you can also find past sessions, including some that we hosted last summer about equity, community engagement, evaluation, and metrics. Second, this session is designed to help participants and recipients of the state and local fiscal recoveries funds effectively implement and report on their use of the funds. Therefore, it is closed to press and an off-the-record session. Third, I want to note that while we will have some time for Q&A at the end, as I mentioned, we'll only be able to take questions related to the topic of today's webinar. We will not be answering specific questions about eligible uses of state and local fiscal recovery funds. For those types of eligible use questions, you may consult the final rule and frequently asked questions on our website, or email our inbox, which is slfrf@treasury.gov. Now, let's get started. As you can see on the screen, the state and local fiscal recovery funds were authorized by the American Rescue Plan Act and deliver $350 billion to state and local, territorial, and tribal governments to support their response to and recovery from the COVID-19 public health emergency. Recognizing that historically underserved communities, including low-income neighborhoods and communities of color, experienced disproportionate impacts of the pandemic, when implementing the SLFRF program, Treasury sought to encourage recipients to address the health and economic disparities and ensure the recovery from the pandemic is truly an equitable one. Up next, we'll look at the SLFRF implementation approach. But if you want more information on the overall state and local fiscal recovery funds program, you can find that on our website. As we've already discussed, equity is a key principle for effective economic recovery that leads to long-term prosperity for people across the country and our country as a whole. And as we'll highlight today, performance metrics and evaluation are key tools to advance equity. But as background, let me highlight 4 key ways that Treasury's implementation approach advances an equitable economic recovery. First, Treasury has structured the program's eligible uses to encourage recipients to address underlying health and economic disparities by including a broad menu of automatically eligible uses provided in disproportionately impacted communities. This approach makes it easier for recipients to address underlying disparities that contributed to more severe impacts of the pandemic in underserved communities. Second, and relatedly, Treasury has expanded eligible populations so recipients can serve families and communities hardest hit by the pandemic by presuming that all low-income households and communities were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and therefore automatically eligible for the broadest range of services. Third, Treasury has designed the reporting guidance to support equity by encouraging recipients to engage their communities in the design of their SLFRF program. Next slide, please. Finally, Treasury recognized its special government-to-government relationship with tribes and is supporting them through consultations that are aimed to ensure that the final rule and reporting approach were tailored to the unique needs of tribal governments. As a result of these efforts in this first year, the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds program has delivered much needed resources to communities across the country, helped revitalize the economy, and ensure that funds reach the communities that most need them. If you'd be interested in learning more about how Treasury designed the state and local fiscal recovery funds to focus on equitable economic recovery, then it's worth reading the recent White House report on advancing equity through the American Rescue Plan, which is being dropped into the chat. Now let's turn to the newly released Equity and Outcomes Resource Guide that is the basis for today's webinar. Let's start briefly discussing the 4 categories highlighted within the guide: equity, community engagement, evidence-based practices, and performance management, as you can see highlighted on the slide. First, for the purposes of this guide and for the SLFRF program, the definition of equity is based on the President's Executive Order 13985 on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. This executive order defines equity as a consistent, systematic, fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals, including individuals who belong to underserved communities that have been denied such treatment, such as Black, Latino, Indigenous, and Native American persons, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and other persons of color, members of religious minorities, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer persons, persons with disabilities, persons who live in rural areas, and persons otherwise adversely affected by persistent poverty or inequality. We begin the graphic on this slide about equity because we encourage recipients to view equity as the lens through which governments begin their engagement in recovery activities. Second, we define community engagement in the second box on the slide as a deliberate and sustained effort to devise thoughtful strategies to invest in community needs. Third, making evidence-based investments means using new and existing resources to strengthen decision-making, provides an opportunity to test new strategies or to test strategies in new conditions, and conduct rigorous program evaluations to build evidence on what works, for whom, and how. Governments can use the state and local fiscal recovery funds as a tool to build a culture of evidence-based policymaking, learning, and improvement that can outlast the life of just this program. I want to note that for the purposes of SLFRF, the reporting and compliance guidance includes a definition of evidence for this program. Specifically, in the appendix of the reporting compliance guidance, it lays out what kinds of evaluations count as strong and moderate evidence for the particular intervention. It is important to understand this definition of evidence in order to implement effective programs, but also to accurately report evidence information for the SLFRF projects to Treasury as part of the required program reporting. I'll go into reporting in more detail in just a moment. Finally, performance management refers to the broad use of program data to identify goals and monitor results for government programs. This can include using data to identify target populations for specific interventions, gathering output information about how these programs are being implemented to see if course corrections may be necessary, and also monitoring long-term outcomes to see if programs are reaching their goals. And as has been noted, equity can be infused in the process of governing by doing things like looking at demographically disaggregated performance metrics. You will hear more about this approach from our panelists. I want to note again that you can find recordings on Treasury website of the introductory webinars we did last summer on the topics of equity, community engagement, and valuation and metrics to provide a good starting point to understand these concepts. To make sure that governments are prioritizing these important areas when investing in their state and local fiscal recovery funds, Treasury has required certain information as part of its reporting process. Specifically, Tier 1 recipients, which are states as well as localities with more than 250,000 residents, must include information in their recovery plan performance reports about their approach to equity and community engagement. And for projects in certain expenditure categories, they must also include information in their recovery plan about whether the project is evidence-based or being evaluated. Finally, each project in their recovery plan must have a specific performance metrics to measure the results of their state and local fiscal recovery funds. As many know, the next recovery plans are due at the end of July, and last week, Treasury released the updated reporting and compliance guidance, which you can find on our website. Beyond this reporting for our largest recipients in the recovery plan performance reports that all Tier 1 recipients must complete, all SLFRF recipients must include in their project and expenditure reports whether certain types of projects are targeted toward disproportionately impacted communities. This helps delineate the equity impact of all SLFRF projects. It is also worth noting that under the SLFRF final rule, recipient governments are permitted to use funds for data, evidence, and evaluation. This includes building their own capacity in these areas to support effective implementation of SLFRF as well as other programs. Now, let's take a quick look at the guide before we turn to our peer discussion. As I mentioned, this guide was newly released this week and focuses on SLFRF Equity and Outcomes Resource Guide. designed to assist recipient governments to use their funds effectively. And the guide highlights examples of how recipients can apply these equity principles, engage their communities, incorporate evidence-based interventions, and monitor outcomes using performance management strategies. These practices, along with transparency and accountability, are at the core of an equitable economic recovery. The goal of the guide in today's session is to provide recipients with examples from their peers on ways to effectively develop and implement their SLFRF projects. The guide contains examples that can be used throughout the life cycle of SLFRF funded programs and beyond, from policy and project selection through implementation. These strategies, which are in the guide and listed on the slide, include setting goals for jurisdictions' equity work, both in their SLFRF programs and throughout government operations, using equity frameworks and rubrics throughout the project development or selection process, and assessing proposed projects based on equity, identifying high-need populations through means like mapping social vulnerability indices to ensure that services are targeted to communities with the greatest need, offering different types of community engagement opportunities to ensure that voices from underserved communities are heard and can participate in the process, convening diverse leaders and community members to analyze data gathered through the engagement process and recommend focus areas for projects for SLFRF, using evidence by incorporating consideration of evidence-based practices into the budget process, tracking outcomes by collecting data for each project, as well as other areas. Now we'll move on to the next portion of our agenda today, which is a peer discussion. So I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Laura McDaniel, who will lead our discussion with today's speakers. Laura, over to you.
Thank you, Jed. As you'll see on the next slide, we'll have speakers from the state of Colorado and the city of Baltimore with us today. First, Lauren Larson, Director of the Governor's Office of State Planning and Budget from the state of Colorado, will present about how the state links budget requests to evidence. Then Shamaya Kearney, Chief Recovery Officer for the city of Baltimore, will present about Baltimore's performance management and evaluation approach. I'll turn it over to you, Lauren.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks so much. And thank you, Jed, for the great work that Treasury's done. I was wishing I could see everyone on this Zoom because I think I'm in a room of peeps, people who care about using data and evidence. There aren't usually a lot of us in the same room together, so it's pretty exciting. This is really a focus on how can we increase the impact of government. We're people who care about that. How can we build trust in government? We are all people who care about that. So it's really a privilege and a treat to work with you all, to speak with you all today. I've spent about a decade at the Office of Management and Budget of the federal OMB, and then about a decade in Colorado state government working on these government improvements. And I can tell you what US Treasury has done with their emphasis on this for SLFRF is springboard our community of practice. Really, all of us working together on advancing the use of data and evidence in the use of our stimulus dollars is a huge opportunity for this community. Now, I'll start with a simple definition of evidence because I think it can get overly complicated and turn some people off. If the data makes you nervous, if statistical variations aren't your jam, you just think very simply about two key questions that evidence answers. That is, how do we know what we're doing is working? And if it is working, how can we do it better? So that is at the core of what evidence is and what this practice means. And before I show the slides, which I did just throw up a few resource slides for you, I want to talk a little bit about how you can support your practice of evidence. I like to think of it as a sandwich approach where the body of our practice is the meat of the sandwich, but there's a really important top layer, which is engaging decision makers, and a really important bottom layer, which is building staff capacity. And without either of those, our sandwich falls apart and our practice falls apart, our evidence practice. So a few tools in each of those sandwich layers for you. First, on engaging decision makers, Colorado has developed an evidence meter. This is a very simple visual tool to help decision makers in our fiscal community, particularly when we're bringing budget requests to our governor, see where does a request fall on the evidence continuum And does the request advance what we know about how the program works? So I'll call up the slides at the end to show you a visual of it, but this having a tool to engage senior decision makers that's not so complicated, that isn't pages and pages of definition, but can just boil it down to a fairly simple read, has really advanced the practice in Colorado. For example, when we were having to consider budget cuts at the beginning of the pandemic, evidence came in and played a huge role in deciding what we were going to preserve and protect, what we knew, what was working. A second tool to consider is how can we just focus, if you're beginning your practice in evidence, if this is a new journey and feels daunting, can you focus it on just a few key areas? Now, in Colorado, we reached an early agreement with our legislative leadership how to narrow the number of areas we would be investing in. We wanted the funds to really be transformational. We didn't want to spread our SLFRF dollars like peanut butter, little here, little there. We wanted high impact. So we chose select transformational areas, and then we developed a legislative process that allowed for deliberation and brought evidence into the mix. What were the best programs that were working? What if we didn't have that evidence, how would we invest in a pilot and an evaluation to find out if our investments really were going to pay off? So it was, but we couldn't have done that if we had 20, 30 areas. We picked 3 key ones, and I have in the resource document a link to a bill that came out of the process in each of 3 areas, improving behavioral health and tying it to primary care, 2, upskilling our workforce, and 3, building some housing that's affordable. So I'll offer those to you in the resources. But keeping focus, if you're just starting, keep in mind that your decision makers have a lot that's going on. It's really complex. Their decisions, encompass a lot of different factors. And if you're going to be introducing evidence into that, try to narrow the number of areas where you're initially starting on that. Third tool for engaging decision makers is, can you embed this in your standard work, in something that's already happening that engages your top decision makers? So for example, we are using this in our budgeting process, and we're using our evidence meter and bringing that right to the governor. We also have some spend plans, some requirements for agencies where there's discretion in how they can use not only SLFRF dollars, but other ARP dollars that went direct to our agencies. We had this when HR 133 passed as well. All told, we had about 180 programs in 16 different agencies. That's a lot. So there was a lot of standard work around just understanding what was going to go out. And we built evidence into that structure, asking agencies to base their decisions on how they were going to spend the funds on evidence. So that's my top sandwich layer for you. Now on the bottom, and equally important, building staff capacity. This evidence work, it takes work and effort and time. So my first piece of advice we've had a lot of success with in Colorado is recruit your champions. Build a small group that's really excited about this. And I bet there's a lot of these people on the call, and then elevate their work. Are you a decision maker? How can you elevate their work and promote it and be a champion of evidence in your state? Number 2, spend time on training. Spend time and money on training. You heard Jed say that it's an eligible use of SLFRF to spend money on training and evaluations for not only your fiscal recovery funds, but also other programs as well. So that is huge. And I think a leadership role in Treasury advancing this work. And a third idea is to hire a coach. If sometimes a classroom training or a big training doesn't get it, but for example, Colorado's worked with a lot of external partners that have helped us advance this work. We engaged using some of our recovery dollars. We engaged the Colorado Evaluation and Action Lab to go in and coach and support agencies to help them find where do we need to build a better body of evidence? What do we need to be studying more that's in our stimulus programs? And that work has really just been that extra hands and extra expertise that some of our agencies have needed to get things off the ground. So that's the top and the bottom sandwich. And now I'll just click through these slides really quick. If here's our evidence meter. You can see on the left, this showing a program is, we call the reaching a 3 to be the standard that we want all our programs to be at. That means you're measuring outcomes, and I'll show you the detailed definitions on the next slide. But on this on the right here, you'll see, oh, sorry, one sec back on the first. This is what we would show the governor if, for example, the budget request before him was going to move the dial on this evidence meter because it included some evaluation dollars. And we're trying to bake those into all of our regular budget requests now. Next slide. Here's the evidence continuum. Again, we worked on this with external partners and the legislature, and these are the definitions behind each level on that meter. Next slide. We have some legislative champions. It's really exciting that we're now partnering with our legislature on our evidence work. And here's this bill that passed recently. It aligns very closely to the Treasury guidance on the different levels of evidence. So we are pretty excited about that. But this is directly from a bill that's now codifying what we were doing in practice, which is now saying we must be tying our budget requests to evidence. So that's where things have moved to in Colorado. It's pretty exciting. And last slide. Oh, the last slide here is all of the resources in one handy place for you. Our research and evidence webpage, which has our budget instructions with the evidence meter. We also have how we run evaluation. We fund evaluation grants out of our office and the criteria for that. We have the legislation that's been enacted that guides our work in this area. Those 3 bills I mentioned using SLFRF funds. And then last, the SLFRF spending, all of our stimulus program, the spending plan guidance tying to evidence. So I see in the chat, my audio has been disrupted, so apologies for that, but really it's great to be here and I look forward to your questions.
Lauren, thank you for presenting with us today and sharing those key strategies for getting started and thinking about using evidence and metrics. Now it is my pleasure to introduce you to Shemaya Kearney from the City of Baltimore. Shemaya, I'll turn it to you.
Great, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. And I first want to start off with a little bit of kudos to all of you. We are out here building the plane as we fly. And so I know that there have been some challenging days and nights as we look forward to implementing SLFRF in our cities and communities, but we will be better on the other side of it. So I wanted to acknowledge all of you that are doing this work at this time. If you could advance to the next slide, please. So we recognize the need for strategic investment that will improve equity for historically marginalized residents and communities in the city of Baltimore. And with that in mind, we developed a proposal process where city agencies, quasi-government agencies, and nonprofits can apply to the Mayor's Office of Recovery Programs for SLFRF funding. We ask for our applicants to think through an equity lens when proposing their projects. We've also included an equity section in our project proposal template that includes some of the questions that you're seeing on the screen. How will data be used to achieve and document equitable outcomes? How will the target populations be represented in the execution of the project? A focus on underserved communities and how the project accounts for potentially disparate outcomes for underserved communities. We also included a qualified census tract map on our website for the city of Baltimore so that our applicants can go to the map and see if where they're proposing to provide programs and services falls within one of those areas. We also have questions about historical disparities and how will the project mitigate or decrease existing and historical disparities. So we are prioritizing equity in all of the decisions that we're making with SLFRF funding in Baltimore City. Next slide, please. Next slide. So our goal is to use performance data to help demonstrate equity in our return on investment. Obviously, one of the questions that we get often is how are we going to know that we've done something well with our SLFRF funding, and how have we wisely invested? Our focus is on showing that return on investment. And so we've done that by developing metrics for our funded entities. So we reviewed the guidance and the law to make sure that we are instructing our applicants to provide information on performance metrics. We're leveraging existing measures from other efforts. So we have performance metrics that are a part of our budget process and that are in our budget book. So we're looking at those measures and incorporating those into our agreements with our funded entities. We also have the mayor's action plan. And so we're also leveraging those plans and those individual measures to ensure that we are including that as a part of our decision-making for SLFRF funds. We're also coordinating with our funded entities on data collection feasibility for proposed metrics. So what does that mean? Obviously, we can come up with a lot of different performance metrics, but if we're unable to collect the data to be able to answer those questions, then those metrics are not useful. So we've really been working with our agencies to understand what are some of their limitations in collecting data. If we're collecting data in certain ways, might there be any caveats for any data that we're collecting and how we represent it, either in our council reports or in our Treasury reports, just making sure that we're having a common understanding about those measures and metrics before we consider them final. And also to ensure compliance with our performance management efforts, we ensure that performance measures are included in our grant agreements with our external entities and in our interagency agreements with our city agencies and quasi-government agencies. So we're really putting a primary focus on performance because, again, we want to be able to demonstrate return on investment, and not just to the Treasury, but also to our residents who have questions and concerns about how we're going to use this funding and how it's going to make a tangible impact in their everyday life. Next slide. So on this slide, this is just a couple of the measures that we included in our initial recovery plan. Obviously, some of our performance measures are a little bit more robust now that we've had some time to fully digest the final rule, really work with agencies around data collection, having more strategic conversations about what our ultimate goals should be with this funding. So some of our measures have advanced from this, but this is just to give you an idea of the kind of measures that we were thinking about when we first submitted this report, and also just building off of that again to be able to show our return on investment. Next slide. So evaluation and accountability. Beyond the performance measures and being able to demonstrate in data what we've done with the funding, we also want to be sure that we have sound rationale for the proposed projects that our applicants are proposing to us, and making sure that we're leveraging existing research and best practices as a part of our funding decisions. To add that capacity, we're a small team of 10 in Baltimore City. And so to add some additional capacity for data analysis and evaluation, we opted to employ a university partnership approach. So we issued an RFI to local colleges and universities in Baltimore City and surrounding areas, asking for that level of assistance. Sharing information with them on our reporting guidelines and things of that nature so that they understood what our ultimate goals were with providing additional evaluation. We set aside funding specifically for these services, and we have a budget of about $1.8 billion that is across the lifetime of SLFRF. And so we have that money set aside, and we are using those funds on a fiscal year basis for these services. After the RFI, we went through a very rigorous criteria with selecting those university partners, and ultimately selected the University of Baltimore as well as Morgan State University to help leverage local subject matter expertise. These are universities that have done a lot of work in the city. They are well knowledgeable about neighborhoods, about economic challenges in the city, all things data. And so leveraging that local subject matter expertise is really important also in helping us make decisions about how we're utilizing SLFRF funds. Next slide. So some of the ways that we are working with our university partners are on developing research on economic impacts of COVID-19. So we want to understand more about how employment has changed, what industries have been the most impacted. We also want to understand information about demographics. Have women been more impacted by men or vice versa? Are there certain age demographics where we're seeing higher unemployment rates or higher impacts? Also on industries. We know the restaurant and tourism industry has been hard hit, but certainly there are other industries that have been impacted by COVID-19. And so working with our university partners to look at the data to understand beyond those that are really obvious, if you will, what other industries have been impacted and to what degree. Also leveraging existing local-based research and studies. So for example, the University of Baltimore conducted a study on our capital planning and capital investment. So we're looking at that information as we're making decisions about our capital investments with SLFRF and identifying where are the areas based on this research where we might want to consider putting capital projects and making sure that it matches up to where we have identified in those reports that we really lacked capital investment over the last several years. Again, with that focus on underserved communities, this kind of information is very important. We're also developing research on peer cities and use of SLFRF funds. So we're looking at what other cities are doing to understand if we're in line with that. Now, obviously, some of our cities' statistics and demographics may change and differ, but we try to pull a list of those cities that we think are more closely aligned with us with that rationale in mind, but also looking at the amount of funding that those cities and localities are receiving as well. Identify funded projects for evaluation. So there are a number of projects that we're talking to our university partners about to figure out what do we want to evaluate. Once SLFRF funding is done and spent and over, what do we want to be able to say about some of these projects that we funded? So this is just a very short list of some of the evaluations that we're planning. We have a guaranteed income pilot program that we're funding, our small business wage subsidy program, our small business and nonprofit technical assistance program. And then we also have an economic relief fund, which is specific to small businesses and nonprofits that have really been impacted by COVID-19. And so we want to be able to evaluate the impacts that SLFRF funds have had on those organizations and those entities beyond ARPA to make sure that they were sustainable beyond our technical assistance that we provided in any in-hand cash relief that we provided to those organizations. Next slide. So shameless plug for our website. I mentioned that we have a QCT map that is available on our website. We're also starting to explore geocoding. And so if you view some of our reports to our city council, we have information around our economic relief fund and the small businesses and nonprofits that have already benefited, and we have geocoded that by area. So we're starting to be able to show individuals where our investments are going. We also have other resources on our website around equity, one-pagers, our application instructions, our scoring rubric. All that information is available on our website, as well as our funding announcements. So if you have any interest in what we're doing in Baltimore City, please do visit our website. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Shamaya and Lauren. We really appreciate the time that you all took to share with us today about how recipient governments can make their policies and practices more focused on using evidence, metrics, and evaluation. Now I will transition us to a discussion about the national perspective. So we'll hear from two speakers about what they are seeing in the field in terms of best practices on how to incorporate metrics and evaluation in the SLFRF program implementation. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that with us today we have Beth Blower, who is the Executive Director of the Centers for Civic Impact at Johns Hopkins University, who will present about how recipients can use state and local fiscal recovery funds to evaluate and manage their performance. Then Jen Tolentino, Director of Local Practice at Results for America, will discuss uses of evidence and metrics. So first, I will turn to Beth Blower. Beth, will you share with us some of the best practices that you've seen?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to our state and local partners who are on the line, who are working very hard, tirelessly to implement SLFRF. and to really think about not only what this infusion of resources means for them as governments, but also what impacts it will have in the community. And so I wanted to start talking about national trends. And the biggest one that we're seeing is this attempt to making sure that the strategies that you're building at the state and local level, as it relates to your spend, are actually connected to things that matter, not only to the people that live in your communities, but also to your leadership teams. And so one of the things that we're seeing is a real refocusing, and I think we saw this in the examples from Colorado and from Baltimore, around the articulation of priorities. And I think that this is priorities that your states or your local governments are making for themselves, and really working hard to make a connection between investments, using the priorities and a clear set of measurable goals as a way to filter what projects you're investing in, what innovations you're thinking about, and the way that you're structuring your accountability measures. And so oftentimes we think this is low-hanging fruit, but we haven't really revisited in a post-pandemic era, what are the key priorities, what are the focus areas, what are the things that have been revealed over the last several years that really require attention. And so we're seeing a lot of governments really going through a visioning process where they're taking stock of what it is that is most important to them. And they're trying to, for my second big theme, is diversify the voices that they're hearing, whether that's in their city hall or in their state houses. And the community engagement approaches have been variable. They have been consistent and inconsistent. And one of the things that we're hearing from a national perspective is that government is really trying to seek out opportunities to diversify the voices that they're hearing as they're thinking about community-based inputs into their strategies and the way that they're thinking about the work that they're doing. And so what we're seeing is a very targeted approach where cities or where state houses are actually going into the community and using data to guide which communities they're actually entering, to engage in conversation, to make sure that there's an alignment between where there is a presumptive or journalistic approach on what we think is the problem and then what the actual problem is. And there are ways to do that both from a digital perspective, but there's also ways to do that by using data just to guide what communities you're going to and where you're seeking to do work. And so we're really excited to see that the sort of traditional town hall style community engagement approaches are actually being upended through this work in ways that are creating more opportunities in sort of non-business hours, more opportunities in non-traditional platforms to garner community input as we start to design programs. And then we're also seeing lots and lots of places really thinking about equity. And I want to talk a little bit about equity and kind of how demographic data has become a real opportunity, but also I think one of the biggest challenges that we face. Demographic data is not consistently reported across any of the jurisdictions. And even within jurisdictions, we know that demographic data is oftentimes misaligned. So programs define age bands, they define gender spectrums, they define race, ethnicity definitions differently. And so what we're seeing is some attention to governance. I know it's not the most exciting area, but some of the most effective strategies that we're seeing are governments that are taking a pause and saying, we have to have consistent definitions that cut across all of our programs. So at the end of our work, when we're thinking about collective impact and using performance management to really understand fundamentally how these investments are having impacts on communities, that we can do it, and we can do that with authority across all demographic categories. When we have demographic categories that are misaligned, it makes it more difficult to be strategic about making investments. It makes it very difficult about really getting a full fundamental understanding of what the experience is like living, particularly in communities that have been largely divested or have really absorbed the brunt of some of the pandemic and economic challenges that we've all been experiencing. And so we like to talk about this from the perspective of governance, because it is about making sure that you're creating and communicating what those definitions are, what those standards are within your governments, and integrating those also into your framing for reporting, both within the grants, but also in your performance management activities. And so it's important for you to think about that, and for you to think about it from the perspective of measuring also what matters. And so the final thing that I really want to emphasize is it is essential, incredibly important that you are actually measuring things that matter not just to the people that are living in your place, but to your government, and that these are measurable things that you can talk about. And we know that that the program itself has sometimes felt diffuse or non-programmatic, and the onus is really on state and local government right now to weave together their impact and to really start thinking about how this relief is actually going to have an impact for the programs that have been designed, for the projects that have been identified. And so by doing that, and by creating that sort of internal measurement framework, you're allowing yourselves to show the impact that you're having as a government and staying in compliance with the reporting requirements. And it is not easy. As we know, this is an evolving landscape, but having a little bit of that habitualization of the integration of using data and measures as you're going through this work is going to make it much easier for you to be able to be responsive to the continued changing landscape around reporting and also around accountability, and when you're trying to really talk about the impact that you're going to have as you've integrated these funds into your strategies. And so these are the themes that we're seeing. I'm happy to continue to stay in touch with anyone who has additional questions, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our fellow panelists.
Thank you for sharing those themes and examples and for framing ways for recipients to think about evaluating their SLFRF investments. Now I will turn it over to Jen Tolentino to share her perspective. Jen, please take it away.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. It is an honor to be here on behalf of Results for America. I'm Jen Tolentino, the Director of Local Practice, leading our federal recovery initiatives that support state and local governments as they invest evidence-based approaches to deliver measurable, equitable outcomes for all residents. When the state and local fiscal recovery funds were first announced, many people considered them a Band-Aid for revenue lost during the pandemic. And to some extent, that's been true, but recovery funds is a bit of a misnomer. These investments are actually forward-looking. They aren't just about plugging budget holes from COVID-19. They are a chance to reinvent how governments operate by investing in programs and systems backed by data and evidence that make lives better. In fact, Treasury recommends using these funds in such evidence-based programs that will address long-standing inequities that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. We've seen this through an ARP dashboard that we created with Mathematica. The dashboard creates or tracks recovery plan performance reports and looks at jurisdictions' top funding priorities. It also provides a window into how jurisdictions are implementing the 5 key provisions provided in the guidance from Treasury. So that's using evidence and data, prioritizing evidence-based interventions, tracking outcomes through vigorous evaluation, engaging with the public in how these dollars are being spent, and ensuring an equitable recovery for all residents. So far, we've tracked 67 cities, 82 counties, all 50 states, and 2 tribal nations. And we found 3 important trends. The first is government modernization. Jurisdictions are using these funds to grow their fundamental capacity to use data and evidence in the day-to-day delivery of services. So as an example, Detroit, Michigan is spending some of their ARP dollars to build a citywide data warehouse that will help better maintain their data and, importantly, integrate systems across the city. This will have an immediate impact on how they are able to measure and track outcomes, and it will have long-term implications for governing because departments will now be able to get information faster, do quicker analysis of budget and resources, and redirect funding to more effective programs. The second trend we're seeing is government innovation and evaluation. 38% of jurisdictions are now piloting new programs. The flexibility of this funding is leading to a dramatic increase in innovation and new programming with substantive evaluation components, both in state and local government. So for example, the city of Madison, Wisconsin is developing plans to launch a mental health pilot program, Community Alternative Response for Emergency Services, or CARES, and the city plans to fund also an external evaluator to design a study, independently assess the program, and determine the efficacy of that intervention. The third trend we've seen is governments are pairing data with community inputs to drive equitable investments. 74% of jurisdictions are engaging with residents on how to spend recovery funds, and 76% are focused on equity. For example, King County, Washington, they're using an equity dashboard and an impact review tool to ensure its investments of ARP dollars lead to equitable outcomes for its residents. And finally, one of the really exciting trends we're also seeing is that jurisdictions are actively learning from each other. So Durham, North Carolina is adopting an equitable scoring matrix created in Pueblo, Colorado. Springfield, Illinois was inspired by Toledo, Ohio, and their spending plan. And so now they're replicating parts of that can be localized for their community. So to be successful, new projects must have built-in evaluation practices to ensure that their approach is working. And if not, they need the ability to modify the program to ensure it meets the jurisdiction's goals and the residents' needs. So what's next? As the next tranche of funding is being distributed, we at RFA are supporting state and local leaders with tools and resources to ensure data and evidence are at the center of these funding decisions. We also hope to increase their capacity to engage their communities and help make investments that reflect the needs of all residents. Later this year, we will have another round of reports from state and local governments. We will update our American Rescue Plan dashboard to identify new trends in how this federal funding is being spent. It's very easy to put these funds toward the status quo, but it's more important than ever for governments to find out what works and to fund it. The flexibility of these funds combined with data and evaluation allows governments to look ahead and be innovative in a way they never could before. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to change the way government operates. These historic funds can have a monumental effect in the way we tackle challenges in our communities that they've faced for generations. But we need to know which programs work, and uniting evidence with these investments can help us get there. So I can talk about data and evaluation all day, but data isn't just about the numbers and the maps or the matrices. Data makes us ask ourselves, are we doing everything we can to make lives better? So thank you. I will leave you with that and look forward to staying connected and being supportive to however you might need it. Thanks.
Jen, thank you for that. And thanks to both of our speakers for joining us this afternoon. Now I'll turn it back over to my colleague, Jed, who will give you all a few examples of what you can find in the guide.
Thank you, Lauren. Thanks so much again to all our panelists. Just a few examples to build on what our panelists have already shared about how various governments are using evidence metrics and performance management in their approach to their SLFRF investments. For example, in Buffalo, the city's created a new office focused on evidence-based interventions and project evaluation for SLFRF and other recovery programs. They're also developing a data analytics center to take a data-informed approach to evaluating. Washington, D.C. is applying its evidence-based budgeting to SLFRF and using SLF investments in the launch, evaluation, and monitoring hub, which will support evaluation. Finally, as Jen mentioned, Seattle, Washington is disaggregating data to understand who they serve, how well, and with what results, and also implementing a multi-tier performance management framework to understand how they're progressing against economic mobility goals for residents to close race-based gaps. So that concludes our presentation part of the conversation. Now let me turn to the Q&A portion of the conversation. We have a lot of great questions here.